A drone hangs in the sky, not rushing, not committed, watching. Below, nothing looks different. Vehicles, trenches, movement. But the battlefield has already changed, because now, the decision to strike isn't made before launch, it's made during the hunt. And that's exactly what Portugal demonstrated in March 2026. Not a revolution, something more dangerous, a normalization. At Strong Impact 2026, hosted deep inside the training grounds of Santa Margarita military camp, the scene didn't look revolutionary at first glance. Armored vehicles rolled across dusty terrain, artillery units moved with practiced rhythm, and multinational troops coordinated in a way NATO exercises have done for decades. On paper, it was routine. 417 personnel working through another combined arms scenario, with soldiers from Portugal, Spain, France, and Romania blending into a single operational picture. But beneath that familiar surface, something had shifted. This exercise wasn't just about coordination or firepower. It was about inserting a new kind of weapon into the bloodstream of the battlefield. One that doesn't behave like artillery, doesn't think like a missile, and doesn't operate like a traditional drone. As the drills unfolded, attention quietly moved upward, away from the guns and toward the sky, where small, nearly invisible systems lingered longer than expected, circling with intent rather than urgency. They weren't fired and forgotten, they were deployed and held back. That difference changed everything. At the center of Strong Impact 2026 was the live integration of loitering munitions into real operational scenarios, not as an experiment on the sidelines, but as an active participant in the fight. These systems were woven directly into artillery and air defense units, tasked not just with striking targets, but with finding them, confirming them, and choosing the exact moment to engage. It introduced a new rhythm to the battlefield, slower in appearance, but far more deliberate in execution. And that's why the headlines called them something harsher. Not loitering munitions, but suicide drones. Because once they commit, they don't come back. Under its Robotics and Autonomous Systems program, working closely with UA Vision, Portugal didn't set out to build the fastest drone or the most powerful one. It built something far more deliberate, a system designed around a simple but dangerous sequence: search, decide, strike. That might sound like a minor tweak. It isn't. Because for decades, most battlefield weapons followed a different philosophy entirely. You identified a target, you committed a weapon, and after that moment, the outcome was largely locked in. Artillery shells couldn't change their minds. Missiles couldn't hesitate. Once launched, they were already part of the past. Portugal's loitering munitions break that logic. These systems lift off not with urgency, but with patience. They climb into the air and begin to circle, feeding a continuous stream of live imagery back to operators on the ground. The battlefield is no longer a static map marked with coordinates. It becomes a living feed, constantly updated, constantly re-evaluated. Movement is tracked, patterns are observed, targets are not just detected, they are understood. And most importantly, the decision to strike is delayed. An operator can watch a vehicle for minutes, confirm its identity, wait for the right moment, or choose not to engage at all. If the situation changes, the drone can be redirected. If the target disappears, the strike can be aborted. The weapon doesn't demand commitment, it asks for judgment. That flexibility is what places these systems in a completely different category. They are not artillery, which delivers speed and volume but loses vision the moment it fires. They are not traditional UAVs, which can observe endlessly but rely on other systems to actually strike. They sit in the space between, a hybrid of surveillance and destruction, a sensor that can become a weapon at will. And that hybrid role is where their real power lives, because it compresses the entire kill chain, find, fix, decide, strike, into a single system, controlled in real time by a human operator who is watching the battlefield unfold as it happens. Technically, the numbers behind these drones don't look revolutionary. Systems similar to the Atlantis-type platform operate within a familiar envelope: roughly 50 kilometers of range, about 30 minutes of endurance, and a payload of around 3 kilograms. These figures align closely with other small to medium loitering munitions already seen across modern conflicts. There's no dramatic leap in speed, no extreme increase in destructive power, no headline-grabbing specification. And that's exactly why they're dangerous, because the innovation isn't in how far they fly or how hard they hit. It's in when they choose to strike and who gets to decide. This is where Portugal didn't just introduce a new tool, It quietly rewired how existing forces operate. For years, loitering munitions were treated like niche assets. They lived on the edges of the battlefield, handled by special forces or experimental units, deployed in isolated scenarios where their value could be tested without disrupting the larger system. They were interesting, useful even, but not central. Portugal changed that assumption. Instead of keeping these systems at the margins, it pushed them directly into the core of its combat structure. Into artillery units, into air defense units, into the very formations that define how an army delivers firepower and controls the battlefield. That shift sounds administrative. It isn't. Because once these drones sit inside artillery formations, artillery itself begins to change. It no longer relies purely on pre-fed coordinates or forward observers calling in targets. It gains its own eyes in the sky, persistent, patient, and directly linked to the guns. Targets are no longer just plotted. They are watched, tracked, confirmed. Fire missions become dynamic. A position can be observed, evaluated, and struck in the same loop without handing off responsibility across multiple systems. Artillery stops being reactive. It becomes hunters with reach, and the same transformation applies to air defense. Traditionally, air defense units are built to detect, track, and neutralize aerial threats. Their posture is defensive by design, but once loitering munitions are integrated into their structure, that posture shifts. These units can now respond not just by intercepting threats, but by eliminating their source. Launch teams, control stations, lightly protected command nodes, targets that are often fleeting and difficult to hit with conventional means. Air defense stops being passive. It becomes selectively offensive. This dual transformation is the real innovation, not the drone itself, but the role it plays inside the system. A single capability begins to blur boundaries that were once rigid, between surveillance and strike, between defense and attack, between observing the battlefield and shaping it in real time. And once those boundaries blur, the tempo of warfare changes with them. Decisions compress, loops tighten. Units act with more independence because they carry both the sensor and the shooter in one integrated package. The distance between seeing a target and destroying it shrinks dramatically. That's why this matters, because Portugal didn't just add drones to its army, it changed what its army units are capable of being. This is the real shift, and it's easy to miss if you're only looking at hardware. For most of modern warfare, weapons have followed a simple, irreversible logic. The moment you fire, you commit. Artillery shells leave the barrel and cannot be recalled. Missiles launch with pre-programmed intent. Even precision-guided systems, for all their accuracy, are still bound by a decision made seconds, or minutes, earlier. The battlefield moves, but the weapon does not adapt. Loitering munitions break that pattern. They delay commitment. They introduce hesitation. Not as weakness, but as control. Instead of locking in a decision at launch, these systems carry the decision forward with them. They hover over the battlefield, observing in real time, feeding information back to a human operator who is no longer guessing based on outdated coordinates, but watching events unfold as they happen. The strike is no longer pre-decided, it is chosen at the last possible moment. And that single shift changes the entire equation. Targets can be verified, not assumed. A vehicle can be tracked long enough to confirm whether it is hostile or civilian. A position can be observed until the exact right moment, when exposure is highest, when escape is least likely. And if the situation changes, if uncertainty creeps in, the strike can simply not happen. That ability to wait, to confirm, to choose, drives down collateral damage while increasing the probability that when a strike does occur, it actually matters. It also brings something else to the battlefield: adaptability. War is chaotic. Targets move. Information degrades. Situations evolve faster than any pre-planned strike can keep up with. Traditional weapons struggle in that environment because they are built for certainty. Loitering munitions thrive in it because they are built for ambiguity. They can adjust, reposition, redirect, operating inside the chaos rather than being disrupted by it. What emerges from this isn't just a more precise weapon, it's a different kind of system entirely. One that merges sensing, judgment, and action into a single loop. One that turns time into an advantage. Because in a battlefield where everything is uncertain, the side that can delay its decision just long enough to make the right one gains an edge that raw firepower alone cannot provide. This is why calling them just weapons undersells what they are. They are decision systems. And in modern warfare, decision superiority is often what decides who survives and who doesn't. Let's be clear about one thing. Portugal did not invent loitering munitions. These systems have already appeared across multiple battlefields, used by different armies, refined through conflict, and proven in ways that go far beyond a single exercise. The technology itself is not new. What is different is how Portugal is positioning it inside NATO. Because in an alliance, impact doesn't come from invention alone, it comes from adoption. And adoption depends on three things: who builds it, where it sits, and who trains with it. Portugal is checking all three. By developing these systems domestically through partnerships like UA Vision, it reduces dependence on external suppliers, particularly the traditional dominance of US and Israeli drone ecosystems. That matters more than it sounds. In a prolonged conflict, supply chains become vulnerabilities. Availability becomes strategy. A nation that can produce its own systems controls its own tempo. But production alone doesn't shift doctrine. What matters more is where these drones are placed. Portugal isn't treating them as experimental tools or niche capabilities kept on standby. It is embedding them directly into standard units, artillery, air defense, where they become part of everyday operational planning. That is the moment a capability stops being interesting and starts being normal. And once something becomes normal inside one NATO army, it doesn't stay isolated for long. Because of exercises like Strong Impact 2026, Allied forces don't just observe these systems, they train with them. Spanish crews see how they integrate into fire missions. French elements understand how they fit into command structures. Romanian observers watch how decisions are made in real time. What begins as a national capability becomes a shared experience. That's how NATO evolves, not through declarations, but through repetition. Finally, there's the most understated factor: scalability. Portugal is not a massive military power, and that is precisely why this matters. If a smaller NATO member can design, produce, and integrate loitering munitions into its core force structure, then the barrier to entry drops for everyone else. This is no longer a capability reserved for the largest defense budgets. It becomes replicable, adaptable, and increasingly widespread. And that combination, domestic production, doctrinal integration, and multinational exposure, is what allows an idea to spread across an alliance, not because it is new, but because it is usable. Because in NATO, technology doesn't change warfare on its own. Shared practice does. This is where the shift stops being technological and becomes structural. Portugal isn't just buying drones or testing them in controlled environments. It is reorganizing parts of its army around them, standing up dedicated drone units inside artillery branches, and giving those units a defined role, a command structure, and a place in operational planning. That might sound like a bureaucratic adjustment, but in military terms, it's a declaration of permanence. Because once a capability gets its own unit, it stops being optional. It becomes something you plan around. This approach mirrors the hard-earned lessons of the Russia-Ukraine war, where both sides discovered very quickly that drones scattered across units as ad hoc tools were far less effective than organized, specialized formations. Small teams improvising with drones could achieve moments of success, but they lacked coordination, consistency, and scale. Dedicated drone units, on the other hand, brought structure to chaos. They standardized tactics, improved targeting cycles, and maintained constant pressure on the enemy. What emerged from that conflict was a clear hierarchy of effectiveness. Improvisation created flashes, integration created outcomes. Portugal is clearly leaning toward the latter. By embedding drone units within artillery branches, these systems are no longer detached from the main fight. They are tied directly into fire missions, reconnaissance cycles, and command decisions. A drone operator is no longer a peripheral specialist. He becomes part of the same loop as the gun crew, the fire control officer, and the commander making the call. That connection is what creates scale. And scale is what turns drones from an advantage into a constant presence. Because when drones are used occasionally, they are a tool. When they are used continuously, they become an environment. That is the transition now underway. Drones are no longer supporting the battlefield, they are shaping it. And once that happens, every unit that doesn't adapt begins to operate at a disadvantage, not because it lacks firepower, but because it lacks awareness, speed, and the ability to act inside the same decision cycle. That's the quiet revolution. Not louder weapons, smarter structures, and an army that is slowly being rebuilt around them. This isn't a one-off project. It's not a single program, a single contract, or a single exercise meant to showcase a new capability and move on. What Portugal is building goes much deeper than that. It is assembling a multi-domain unmanned ecosystem, one that stretches across land, sea, and the electromagnetic spectrum, and ties all of it together into a coherent way of operating. In the air, companies like TopwaySolution are already fielding systems such as the AR series drones, designed not just for surveillance but for persistent awareness over vast maritime spaces. These platforms can patrol coastlines, monitor shipping lanes, and feed continuous streams of intelligence back to command centers. But more importantly, they are evolving beyond simple observation. With passive electronic warfare payloads, they can detect and locate radar emissions without revealing their own position, quietly mapping the invisible layer of the battlefield where sensors and signals compete. That matters because modern warfare isn't just about what you can see. It's about what you can sense without being seen. At sea, Portugal is pushing even further. Through cooperation with Ukraine, drawing directly from real combat experience in contested waters, it is exploring the development of unmanned surface vessels. These systems are designed to operate where risk is highest, extending reach without exposing crews and adding another layer to a growing network of autonomous and remotely operated platforms. And then there is the most striking piece of the puzzle, the NRP Dom Joao II, a dedicated drone carrier, not a modified warship, not an auxiliary platform, a vessel built from the ground up to deploy, coordinate, and sustain unmanned systems, both aerial and maritime. It represents a shift in thinking at the naval level, where the focus moves away from traditional ship-to-ship engagements and toward distributed networks of smaller, more flexible systems operating across wide areas. Let that sink in, because when a country begins designing ships specifically to carry drones, it's no longer experimenting with unmanned systems. It is committing to them. And when you step back and look at all of this together, the loitering munitions on land, the ISR and electronic warfare drones in the air, the unmanned vessels at sea, and the infrastructure to support them, it becomes clear that Portugal isn't just adding drones to its military. It is reorganizing around them, building a force where unmanned systems are not an accessory but a foundation. A network where sensing, striking, and decision-making are increasingly distributed across machines, all connected, all feeding into the same operational picture. And once that kind of ecosystem takes shape, it doesn't just change what a military can do, it changes how it thinks. Let's cut through the headline. Change NATO warfare forever. That sounds dramatic, final, irreversible. It's also an exaggeration, because nothing unveiled here rewrites the laws of physics or introduces a capability the Alliance has never seen before. These drones are not faster than everything else in the sky. They don't fly farther than existing systems, they don't carry dramatically larger payloads or deliver some unprecedented destructive effect. NATO has already fielded loitering munitions across multiple countries in multiple forms over several years. So no, this is not a technological breakthrough. It is not the first time NATO has used these systems. It is not a leap in raw performance. If you judge it purely by specifications, it looks familiar. And that's exactly why many people miss what actually matters, because what Portugal demonstrated isn't about the drone itself. It's about where the drone now lives inside the system. This is a doctrinal milestone, a moment where a capability crosses a threshold, from being tested to being trusted, from being peripheral to being embedded. Once something becomes part of doctrine, it changes how units plan, how commanders think, and how operations are executed. It stops being optional. It becomes expected. It is also a structural integration. These systems are not sitting in isolated programs or experimental units waiting for validation. They are being placed directly into artillery and air defense formations, tied into command chains, logistics, and training cycles. That means they will show up not occasionally, but consistently. Every exercise, every deployment, every operational plan. And perhaps, most importantly, it is a signal. A signal to NATO that this is no longer a niche capability, that even smaller members can develop, integrate, and field these systems independently. That unmanned, expendable precision strike is becoming part of the Alliance's baseline, not its edge. That's how change actually spreads in NATO. Not through a single invention, but through visible adoption. Not through headlines, but through repetition. So the shift isn't in the drone, it's in the system that now expects the drone to be there. And once that expectation sets in, the battlefield adjusts around it. Portugal is proving something that larger powers often overlook. You don't need the biggest platforms to influence how war is fought. You don't need a next-generation fighter program or a billion-euro missile system to shift doctrine. What matters is how intelligently a capability is integrated, how deeply it is embedded into the way forces actually operate. And in that sense, a smaller NATO member like Portugal can punch far above its weight, because it is not trying to outbuild the giants, it is trying to outadapt them. By focusing on integration instead of scale, Portugal is demonstrating a model that is far more accessible to the rest of the alliance. A model where effectiveness comes from combining systems, linking sensors, shooters, and decision makers into a continuous loop, rather than relying on a few expensive assets to dominate the battlefield. That model is quietly becoming the blueprint, because the real battlefield change isn't about a single system replacing another, it's about the environment those systems create together. In future NATO operations, the battlefield will be saturated with persistent drone surveillance. Not occasional coverage, but continuous presence. Eyes in the sky that rarely blink, constantly feeding information into the network. That alone changes how movement, concealment, and timing are managed. On top of that, precision strikes will become available on demand, not reserved for high-value targets or complex coordination, but accessible at lower levels of command, delivered by systems that are already in position, already observing, already waiting. Firepower itself will become more distributed. Instead of concentrating destructive capability in a handful of high-end platforms, it will be spread across numerous smaller, cheaper systems, each individually limited, but collectively overwhelming. The loss of one will matter less because another is already in the air. And through all of it, the human element remains, but in a different role. Decisions will still be made by people, but those decisions will be enabled, accelerated, and informed by machines that extend perception, compress time, and reduce uncertainty. The human doesn't disappear. The human becomes the final authority inside a much faster loop. This is the direction of travel. Fewer massive, centralized assets that dominate through sheer capability. More cheap, connected, expendable systems that dominate through presence, persistence, and coordination. And once that balance shifts, the definition of power shifts with it. Not who has the biggest weapon, but who can see more, decide faster, and act at the right moment.